Hello, everybody. I'm Andrés from Qualia Research Institute, and I'm going to be talking about quantifying valence. Basically, I think this is maybe one of the most important questions when it comes to consciousness. What is happiness, and what actually is a pleasant versus unpleasant experience? So, kind of like a rough outline of the talk is that first I'm going to talk about like why valence matters. Then how do you find valence in the brain? What are like some perspectives on that? Then valence within our framework. We have a framework for understanding consciousness and modeling it, and we're going to try to find valence there. And finally, some methodologies and predictions about how we expect valence to look like on brains on MDMA as well as psychedelics. So, first of all, what is valence? As I said, the pleasure-pain axis. Usually, emotion tends to be divided between among two axes. So you have kind of the axis of arousal, basically how much energy or activation you're experiencing. And then you have the axis of valence, how positive the experience is. And of course, you have like the entire range of combinations. I mean, you can have like high valence, high arousal, being excited, but also you can be experiencing a very pleasant state even though you may be very relaxed, like peacefulness. And then you have anxiety and depression, which is the other sides of the quadrants. That said, emotion is far more complicated than this. In my graduate studies at Stanford, I modeled transition probabilities between emotions and basically found that in order to really be able to predict how emotions will transition into the future, you really need to have like at least 6 or 7 dimensions. 2 dimensions are not enough. And really there's like a lot of texture in emotions. I mean, it's not enough to just say like, hey, I'm feeling good and I'm feeling energetic. There's like a lot more to emotion than just those 2 components. And we think that with our framework and with our theory, we can actually get at like what exactly is the texture of emotion and do so scientifically. So our framework, basically we are, first of all, we believe that consciousness is real, that completely, absolutely important aspect of reality and the universe. But more than that, we believe in what we call Qualia Formalism. And that is that for any conscious experience, there exists a mathematical object isomorphic to it. I mean, just as in physics, we've gotten a lot of mileage by assuming that there's a mathematical object isomorphic to an electron or like 2 electrons interacting and so on. We think that the same is going to happen with consciousness, that we're going to identify a mathematical object whose properties are isomorphic to the way in which an experience feels like. And that this is going to be a huge breakthrough in understanding consciousness. More so, we are valence realists. I mean, we really believe that whether a person is in a state of suffering or a state of happiness, there is a matter of fact about that. I mean, it's just there is a rest mass for the electron. A brain could be in a state of suffering, and that could be a completely objective aspect of the universe at that point in time. And when you combine these two, you actually get a valence structuralism, which says that valence could have a simple encoding in the mathematical representations of the system's qualia. In other words, when you take the mathematical object that represents a state of consciousness, what is it? Whether that state of consciousness is positive, negative, neutral, mixed, will depend on the mathematical features of that object, which makes the problem of happiness and suffering tractable, potentially. Okay, so bliss. Like, how do people approach valence in general? I mean, there's definitely a lot of people interpret valence like very positive states of consciousness as some sort of like a spiritual signal. Like you're meditating, you're connecting to the universal mind, and you feel really good. Maybe you're doing God's work or whatever, and you feel good like that. You kind of like feel that the universe is telling you, hey, you're on the right track and whatnot. The problem is that people have like very different spiritual conceptions, very different views of like what is good in the world. So there's a lot of inconsistencies. Whatever that signal is, it seems to be very noisy. I would not necessarily trust that interpretation. Then there's also the merely chemicals in the brain, kind of a deflationary account of like pleasure and pain. But like we know that's definitely not the full story, because if you inject dopamine in the cortex or opioids in the occipital lobe, that doesn't feel good in particular. Like opioids only feel good in very specific regions in the brain. So just like chemicals in your brain, that's clearly not a full story. Pleasure is not in serotonin. Pleasure is not in endorphins in and of themselves. You need far more conditions to satisfy than that. And then, of course, you have kind of the crowd who says it's just activation in the pleasure centers. And empirically, yes, if you stimulate the pleasure centers, that tends to be very blissful, extremely pleasant experiences. But just because you're calling something the pleasure center doesn't mean you understand why it works as a pleasure center. I mean, it's just an empirical observation. Hey, this part of the brain is associated very strongly with valence. But why? Why would that be the case? Of course, you have people who think of valence as health. But obviously, you could take a very strong euphoriant drugs, even though you're completely in a very poor state of health. So that's definitely not a necessary condition. And also reinforcement learning. A lot of computationalists or functionalists think, hey, pleasure is just reinforcement learning. But empirically, we know that there exists pleasure without reinforcement and reinforcement without pleasure. So that's definitely a red herring. The view that we advocate, and I'm going to justify why, is basically the concept that pleasure and valence ultimately come down to symmetry. Symmetry in consciousness, but then it's kind of like back up. It's not just like symmetry in kind of like an arbitrary sense of like, hey, like this brain is more symmetrical, but it's symmetry in the mathematical object whose properties are isomorphic to a person's experience. So why symmetry? So here are like a couple examples, like music, art, mathematics. They feature symmetry all over the place. It's fascinating. If you look at them closely, kind of like the bulk of what music, art, and mathematics end up being accounted for is there's this very complex phenomena, very complex pattern, and the brain finds simple encodings using symmetrical transformations that accounts for most of the pattern as possible. And doing that is very pleasant. I mean, you have these very complex equations that reduce to something very simple, or these very complex harmonies or canons that reduce to a very simple pattern, repeated and translated in interesting ways. Meditation, some people may say like, well, but meditation is very complex. But if you look at actually kind of the phenomenology of a lot of meditation, for example, concentration meditation, is all about getting rid of the complexity of thinking. You're trying to get rid of rumination. You're focusing all of your attention into just one single point or one single percept, like breath, that really simplifies the amount of information in your experience. And why is that pleasant? Well, I think like nobody really has an answer unless you take into account something like the Symmetry Theory of Valence. Orgasm. So orgasm is really fascinating because it's one of the most intense states of bliss that people can achieve naturally without training. And it's a... And the EEG signatures of orgasm are really similar to brain entrainment. Basically, when they flash strobes at you or repeating sounds, is an extremely simple neurological pattern. But like, why would a very simple pattern be so pleasant? Well, if you don't have something, a symmetry account of pleasure, then like that just doesn't make sense. And as we will see, hopefully, we will also demonstrate that MDMA and LSD, that is also the case. Now, two notes. It's important to understand that there's this big confusion. People usually externalize their source of pleasure. They think, oh, well, I love ice cream, but she doesn't love ice cream or whatever. In reality, I think we all love the same thing. The thing is that ice cream may trigger a high valence state in you, but may not trigger that state in the other person. And we could potentially reprogram how our senses work such that salad just produces extraordinary bliss. It's just that evolutionarily, the mapping between high-calorie, high-glucose foods and like high valence was just adaptive, so that we're stuck with it for the time being. Okay, so the Symmetry Theory of Valence. Basically, here are kind of like some of the core tenets. First, consciousness is a real and measurable thing. We're not deflationary. Harmony feels good because it's symmetry over time. I mean, the reason why harmony in music feels good is really because it's a kind of symmetry. Then dissonance is anti-symmetry. And that's something important to note, that dissonance is actually usually a fairly simple stimuli as well. It's just overlapping symmetries that don't fit together. And that is unpleasant. That's what we would account as the source of negative experiences. Pleasure centers work as tuning knobs of harmonic patterns. Like the reason why when you activate the pleasure centers it feels good is because the pleasure centers are strategically positioned at the functional center of the brain such that they can modulate whole brain harmonic patterns, which provides an explanation for like, hey, why the hell these tiny regions of the brain would be associated with hedonic tone? This would be the explanation. Boredom is an anti-symmetry mechanism. If you repeat the same symmetries over and over, your brain detects that you're not learning, and it introduces dissonance for you to move on. People who have an overactive boredom system, they become depressed, and people who don't have an overactive or who don't have a boredom system, they just don't learn. So actually, kind of intelligence might be an interplay between having a well-calibrated boredom system. And as I said, yeah, we are wired so that what helps us reproduce symmetrifies our consciousness. Ice cream makes our consciousness more symmetrical temporarily. Euphoriant drugs modify the neuroacoustics of the brain. Like the reason why cocaine or heroin feel good is because they make your brain resonate in specific ways. The brain activity resonates in specific ways that makes it more harmonic. And finally, yeah, music fools the boredom mechanism by introducing interesting symmetries. Once you are bored of the symmetries you know how to handle, you need new ones so that you can actually, your brain can, again, like interlock into those states before you get bored. So let me give you some examples. This is really stunning. A lot of people say like, hey, like music is very subjective, different cultures like different music, and that's true. But that's not the case when you look at the very big picture of like the very rough qualities of sound. So this is basically pure noise. So we would say that this is a neutral state. So in fact, if you're experiencing a lot of distress, listening to white noise is very soothing. We will interpret that because it's smoothing out and softening the dissonances that are going on. However, if you're trying to listen to a symphony, listening to white noise is just going to blunt that beautiful, those beautiful patterns. So you don't want that. All right. So this is dissonance. So yeah, just pretty negative valence. Like if you don't have a theory that explains why dissonance it feels bad, then you don't really have a theory of pleasure. Then finally, I also had a little bit of a consonance just to smooth that out. Right, probably any of these would do. Right, even just like 1 or 2 seconds, you notice, okay, that's high valence. It's like really puzzling. Like, why would that be? Of course, if you listen to a simple pattern like that over and over and over for 3 hours, you get bored and irritated. And that's why you need like novelty because of the anti-symmetry boredom mechanism. But on its own, just like the very raw base quality of sound is enough to trigger different hedonic qualities. And one interpretation of this is that the amount of pre-processing that happens between the auditory signal and whole brain harmonic states is very, very short. There's very little pre-processing. So you can alter the symmetry of your brain activity very directly through sound, as opposed to vision or language. It's a little bit more difficult. Okay, so how do we measure bliss then? If the symmetry theory of valence is correct, the answer would be to find ways of measuring consonance, dissonance, and noise in brain activity. And these would test the symmetry theory of valence. And here's where we come to kind of like really awesome groundbreaking research. 2016, Selen Atasoy and other people have been basically developing a paradigm that identifies resonant modes in brains. Now, rather than being a mechanical wave like it is in this Chladni plate, we're talking about an electromagnetic wave. But the principles applies. The main principle here is that there is a set of frequencies such that when you propagate the wave in the system, the wave actually fits an integer number of times within that system. So there's a discrete number of resonant modes for any one of these systems. If you go from 100 to 1,000 hertz in one of these plates, you won't see that any given frequency produces a pattern. It's more that there's like 7 patterns and then there's phase transitions between them. And it seems to be that the brain works something like that as well. So again, like there's a discrete number of ways in which a system can resonate. And their work is pretty amazing because they're translating kind of this paradigm to the brain by modeling gray matter and white matter tracks and modeling an excitation inhibition wave in that space. And the analogy would be something like this. I mean, these are like spatiotemporal resonant modes where the red side is excitation, statistical excitation across millions of neurons and action potentials, whereas the blue side would be inhibition, just like less activity. And on a given point in time, you're experiencing a weighted sum of each of these harmonics. And think there's like about 100 or something in that space. So within Qualia Formalism and Valence Structuralism, we would postulate that what makes a mood is the precise weighted sum of harmonics that you're experiencing on a given point in time. Now, the question becomes, how do you transform these weighted harmonics into valence, like whether you're experiencing good or bad sensations? Well, the idea remains that we should find consonance, dissonance, and noise in this pattern. And we can basically be inspired by research on sound. Basically, what makes a sound dissonant? It turns out that there's this critical window of the ratios between frequencies of pure tones, where, for example, if you have 400 hertz and 450 hertz together, that sounds very, very dissonant. Whereas if you have like 400 and 800 hertz together, that sounds really good. And this has a symmetry interpretation, where like 400 and 450 hertz together, they don't actually make a nice repeating pattern within the window of attention, and therefore that is an asymmetric structure, which would explain why it's negative within the symmetry theory of valence. And then we import this into the space of brain harmonics. Then we will get something like this, where brain harmonics that are somewhat similar within the dissonance window that are activated simultaneously would be producing neurological dissonance. And we would associate that with negative valence. Whereas brain harmonics that are sufficiently far away or make integer multiples of each other, they would be at consonant state with each other. So the algorithm would be, first of all, you decompose the state of the brain into its harmonics. Basically, you subtract noise in that way. Everything that you can't explain in terms of brain harmonics, interpret it as noise. And that itself will have a spectral power distribution. The second step is you denoise the harmonic superposition. That's maybe the trickiest part here, and we can talk about it offline. But the core idea is that if you have a lot of brain harmonics within the same range, that doesn't necessarily imply dissonance, because that could be noise. And that's important to take into account. And then you compute the spectral power distribution of the dissonant component. In other words, when you have high-frequency harmonics that are in a state of dissonance, that would be high-frequency dissonance. When you have low-frequency harmonics in a state of dissonance, that would be low-frequency dissonance. And the experiential character of that dissonance might be different. Maybe high frequency might correspond to kind of anxiety or irritation, whereas low frequency dissonance might correspond to depression or nausea. And finally, what remains is the consonant spectral power distribution. The payoff is that you would be able to model your current emotional state in a very simple way like this. So here what we have is basically all of brain harmonics. The black circles represent the amplitude of them, and the lines represent whether their interaction is consonant or dissonant. Then what you do is you transform all of those interactions into what we call the CDNS, the Consonance-Dissonance-Noise Signature of the state. And this one has a neutral end, a negative end, and a positive end. And also it has an associated spectrum for each of those. So a person with this CDNS would be in a fairly neutral state. A person here, this would be very positive. Their brain harmonics are in a state of high consonance. And more so, that consonance might be biased towards like high frequency. So they may be like very excited, for example. And this is a person in a state of suffering or high amounts of discomfort. Their brain harmonics are highly dissonant with each other, at least the dominant ones. And maybe their dissonance is mostly based on like high frequency. So maybe this is a person who's very irritated. And now on to the testable predictions. We're not here only to speculate. We're here to make precise testable predictions. Will the theory fly or sink? Float or sink. We could fly too. Yeah, so some of the core testable predictions is that psychedelics, their mechanism of action, the reason why psychedelics feel so emotionally intense is that they increase consonance and dissonance, and they reduce noise. On the other extreme, you have SSRIs. Basically, they would work in this theory as they just add noise into the neural environment, and therefore they reduce both consonance and dissonance. Similar to this little white noise device. They just blunt everything. And MDMA, they increase a special set of harmonics that are highly consonant with each other. And there's a couple more predictions. I think I'm probably running out of time, so let me just go through very quickly. SSRIs, their main effect is like they have like lower resonance overall and less harmony and less dissonance. Psychedelics, one way of describing them, one-liner would be psychedelics are neuroacoustic enhancers. And that's why they amplify emotion in both extremes. Just very negative and very positive emotions are possible on psychedelics. Kind of just to illustrate this fact, I mean, it seems, at least phenomenologically, let alone through like brain connectome harmonics, one of the main kind of signatures of psychedelics is tracing, where actually you see copies of whatever you experienced right before, which suggests a lot of resonance between whatever states you're experiencing. Things last for a lot longer and they repeat over and over. And the precise frequencies at which that is happening might determine the valence of your experience. And more intriguingly, they also lower what we call the symmetry detection threshold, where you can look at a patch of grass and it starts to symmetrify and then it becomes a complete tessellation. Anecdotally, we have verified that all the 17 possible wallpaper symmetries, which is all the ways you can tessellate a plane, are possible to experience as what we call peak symmetry states on psychedelics, and they're all extremely pleasant, extremely blissful, for reasons that would make no sense unless the symmetry theory of valence was correct. If you go on sensory deprivation, you can make your whole experience basically snap into a supersymmetry on a psychedelic, and that tends to be extremely blissful. We hypothesized that peak experiences, mystical experiences on psychedelics are actually supersymmetrical states of consciousness, extremely resonant, extremely high valence, that leaves a footprint or an echo in your brain that then like allows you to actually have high valence later on. There's like something to kind of reflect on or remember about. You might not need only trained psychonauts. You could probably induce these. This is some GIFs that we generated. This is one particular wallpaper symmetry group. And on a psychedelic, this looks extremely interesting. Basically, the entire visual field becomes tessellated, and you get immersed into this particular symmetrical pattern. And also, it seems to be associated, anecdotally at least, with very high valence. It's very, very pleasant to look at this on a psychedelic. And yeah, just to conclude, this is the final slide. In addition to making predictions for MDMA, we're also making predictions that we could basically train psychonauts to go into the supersymmetrical states. And we would predict that they will say they're very pleasant. And also we will predict that on the brain harmonics paradigm, they will be very consonant states. And the payoff is that in the future, we will be able to measure what is the reason why a person is suffering. It could be, hey, your dissonance comes from the 17th and 19th harmonic. Take this extremely obscure substance. Most people who take it, they don't feel anything, but for you, it's going to get rid of like your particular brand of depression. And that's it. Well, thank you very much.
Okay, question.
Thanks, Andrés, for that. That was amazing. I have a question about what you think the relationship between evolutionary pressures and the type of symmetry of valence that you experience is, in terms of, it seems like it's possible that if you sort of optimize for the valence and symmetry, that might not be optimizing for evolutionary pressures.
Yes.
So how do we kind of match maximization of those to sort of maximize holistic well-being across time?
Right. I mean, it's no. I think there's no question that negative valence can be, and it was evolutionarily advantageous in the past. I mean, definitely states of jealousy, depression, anxiety, rumination clearly have been useful for reproduction to some extent. I would question whether it's still wise for us as a society to try to preserve them. I mean, we could potentially generate an environment such that that is just not evolutionarily advantageous. And part of the kind of the philosophy that we should aim to create societies where we are animated by gradients of bliss, and we don't have to ever go into states of suffering if we manage to basically find all the things for which suffering is useful and then import them into another domain. But yeah, I mean, depression saves calories, but it's a very awful way of implementing a saving calorie program to just making you feel really awful. Yeah.
Very interesting ideas, really. I'm just curious about how you would measure the dissonance, like in the spectrum of the connectome harmonics or those type of harmonic brain states, any of those. Because technically, given the connectivity of the human brain, there are almost infinite many. Not infinite many in reality, but we can measure up to, I don't know, maybe 20,000 of them. would you focus rather on the low frequencies, which rather match networks and so on, or would you focus on the whole spectrum?
That's a good question. I would like to explore the whole spectrum. My suspicion is that if you purify some of these harmonics, as in, for example, I don't mean it in a kind of like technical sense, but I mean it more in the experiential sense. Like if you present this kind of stimuli, or you get psychonauts who are like really good at snapping into supersymmetrical states, the brain connectome harmonics will be shown to be very sharp. Like there's going to be very, very narrow band. So in that case, you could basically discretize it. Think of them as a unified harmonic, rather than, just like a very large number of them. Does that make sense?
In the visual cortex, yes, but I would suspect in the whole brain, it would still be a very broad range of harmonics activated.
Okay,
I mean, we
interesting.
can discuss further, but it just feels like in the visual cortex, I would argue yes,
Mhm.
because on visual hallucinations, they show that it's similar type of harmonic patterns which dominate the visual cortex in these type of hallucinations. But in the overall thalamocortical system, I wouldn't think so, necessarily.
Okay, cool. Interesting.
No. One.
You had two, one was pleasure pain axis and one was arousal level.
The level.
Yeah, all the emotions are having two independent variables, so to say.
Yes.
I would ask you, there are certain emotions that have time effects.
Yes.
So, certain emotions have a lot of after effects.
Yes.
How do you analyze them?
Right. I mean, that would be not a feature of the emotion, instantaneous feature of the emotion, right? But like it's something you would still care about in terms of how it influences your well-being over time, right? But one of the things I was mentioning here is that when I analyzed how emotions transition from one to another, there's some emotions that have like very interesting properties, like for example, feeling hopeful or feeling relieved, because they predict that you were in a very negative state and also that you're going to move towards a positive state. And that's like in addition to the valence and arousal of those two emotions. So there's definitely a lot more dimensions to emotion when it comes to like how they predict future emotions, what emotions you were before, and how much they're going to last, right? Like the supersymmetrical states and psychedelics or peak experience, they can make you feel good for a whole year. Like or very deep meditation as well. Yeah. Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.